A young couple, Sarah and Mike, moved into a small apartment complex in a quiet neighborhood. It was an older building with a lot of character, and they loved how peaceful it was. There was only one other tenant on their floor, a man named Greg, who lived directly across the hall. Greg was in his 40s, thin, with an unsettling quietness about him. He rarely made eye contact and always kept his head down, muttering to himself as he walked by. At first, Sarah and Mike didn't think much of him. Some people are just quiet, they figured. But as the weeks went by, things started to get strange. They'd come home to find that things in their apartment were slightly out of place. A drawer would be open that they were sure they'd closed, or a glass would be missing from the kitchen, only to reappear a day later. They started to feel uneasy, wondering if they were just being forgetful, or if someone was actually entering their apartment when they weren't home. One night, as they were getting ready for bed, they heard a faint tapping sound coming from somewhere in their apartment. They looked around but couldn't find the source. The tapping seemed to move first in the bedroom, then in the living room, then back near the front door. Sarah joked that they must have a ghost, but Mike was beginning to worry that something more sinister was going on. Just as he was about to dismiss it, they heard a sound that made their blood run cold, the unmistakable click of their door lock turning. They froze. Mike quickly went to the door, peering through the peephole. On the other side, he saw Greg, his ear pressed to the door, listening. He was breathing heavily, and in his hand, he was holding a set of lock-picking tools. Mike's heart raced as he watched Greg turn and slowly walk back to his apartment, muttering to himself. Sarah was terrified, and they both knew this had gone far beyond strange noises or missing items. Greg was trying to break into their apartment. The next day, they contacted the building manager to report what had happened, but the manager seemed oddly dismissive. He assured them that Greg was harmless, just a bit of an oddball, and that he'd been living in the building for years without any issues. Sarah and Mike didn't feel reassured. They decided to install a cheap security camera inside their apartment, just in case. That night, they set up the camera in their living room, pointing toward the door. Around 2 a.m., they were startled awake by a strange sound coming from the living room, a soft, rhythmic scratching. Mike checked the camera feed on his phone and saw a live view of the door handle slowly turning back and forth. Someone was outside their door, trying to get in. They watched in horror as Greg's face appeared on the camera, his eye peeking through the peephole, his mouth moving in a silent whisper as he tried to turn the handle. They decided to call the police. Within minutes, officers arrived and knocked on Greg's door. There was a tense silence before they heard Greg's slow, shuffling footsteps. He finally opened the door, looking bleary-eyed, as if he'd just been woken up. The officers questioned him for a while, but he denied everything, saying he'd been asleep. The police couldn't do much without hard evidence, so they left with a warning. Feeling defeated, but determined to get to the bottom of things, Sarah and Mike reviewed the camera footage from the night. What they found chilled them to the core. The footage showed Greg entering their apartment in the early hours of the morning while they were asleep. He walked slowly through their living room, muttering to himself, picking up items from their shelves, looking at family photos, and putting them back. At one point, he even stood by their bedroom door, watching them sleep. The next morning, They decided they couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. They packed up and went to stay with a friend while they figured out their next move. But the story didn't end there. A few days later, they received a call from the building manager, who was in a state of shock. After they'd left, he'd received complaints from other tenants about strange noises coming from Greg's apartment, and he'd decided to check it out himself. Inside, he found an entire wall covered in photos of Sarah and Mike, taken from various angles around the building through their windows, down the hallway, even from inside their own apartment. Disturbed by what he found, the manager finally contacted the police again. When the officers arrived, they discovered even more unsettling things. Greg had a collection of Sarah and Mike's belongings, things they hadn't even realized were missing. There were personal items, toothbrushes, a hairbrush, a scarf, and handwritten notes detailing their daily routines, their favorite foods, even their phone numbers. It turned out Greg had been stalking them from the day they moved in, sneaking into their apartment whenever he could to get closer to them. After his arrest, he was found to have a long history of similar behavior, but he'd managed to evade suspicion each time by moving from place to place. To this day, Sarah and Mike say they're haunted by the thought that someone was watching them, getting closer to them every night as they slept, completely unaware. That was the last time they ever chose to live in an apartment without knowing everything about their neighbors. Emma had just moved into her new apartment after a tough breakup. It was a small but cozy place in an older 3-story building with only 6 units, and it even had a shared basement for storage. The neighborhood was peaceful, and she hoped the new start would help her move on with her life. But it wasn't long before things took a strange turn. Her only neighbor on her floor was a man named Mr. Wilkins. He was in his late 50s, with a slightly unkempt appearance and a heavy smell of tobacco that seemed to linger wherever he went. He mostly kept to himself, but occasionally she'd pass him in the hallway. Each time he would stare at her a little too long without saying a word, making her feel uncomfortable. Emma brushed it off, thinking he was just a lonely old man. One night, she came home to find her mailbox slightly open, which was strange because she was sure she'd closed it. Inside, she found a note, written on old yellowed paper. In scrawled handwriting it read, "I see you every day." There was no name or explanation, just those 5 unsettling words. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She assumed it was just a prank by some neighborhood kid, so she tossed the note away. But over the next few days, things started to feel off. Sometimes, she'd come home to her door unlocked, even though she was certain she'd locked it. Or she'd find things in her apartment slightly moved, like her keys or a cup in the kitchen. Once she even thought she smelled cigarette smoke in her living room, but shrugged it off as her imagination. A few weeks later, Emma was woken up by a strange sound around 2 a.m. It was coming from the wall that separated her apartment from Mr. Wilkins' unit. She could hear faint scratching and quiet, almost wheezing breaths. She told herself it was just an old building with thin walls, and that maybe Mr. Wilkins was having trouble sleeping. But then one evening, as she was going down to the basement to put away some boxes, she heard footsteps following her down. She turned around to see Mr. Wilkins standing at the top of the basement stairs, watching her with an intense, almost vacant look. His gaze followed her as she went into the storage area, but he said nothing, just stood there, staring. Emma forced herself to act casual, placing her boxes in her storage unit and quickly headed back upstairs. That night, she locked her door tightly, double-checking it before bed. The following night, she woke up to the scratching noise again, only this time it seemed louder, closer, like it was coming from inside her apartment. Emma froze, her heart pounding. She got up slowly and crept into the hallway. The noise was coming from her coat closet. She felt a chill go down her spine as she reached for the closet door. Bracing herself, she threw it open, only to find nothing inside except her winter coats and an old shoebox. Shaken, she closed the closet and went back to bed, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, she went to talk to the building manager, mentioning the strange noises and the incidents with her unlocked door. The manager seemed skeptical, but agreed to check it out. Later that day, she received a call from the manager, who sounded disturbed. He told her there was something she needed to see. When she arrived, he led her down to the basement, where he opened the door to an unused storage room she'd never noticed before. Inside, they found an old mattress, a pile of clothes, and stacks of yellowed papers covered in writing. On one of the walls, there was a hole drilled through to her apartment directly behind her coat closet. She realized, horrified, that Mr. Wilkins had been watching her through that hole for who knows how long. Some of the papers in the storage room even contained detailed notes about her routine, things she hadn't even realized he could have known. The police were called, and Mr. Wilkins was finally questioned. It turned out he had been living in the building for years, hiding his obsession from everyone. He admitted he'd been sneaking into her apartment whenever he could find an opportunity. The strange notes, the unlocked door, the smell of cigarette smoke, all had been his doing. Apparently, he'd been driven by some fixation with Emma, believing that she was somehow destined to be with him. Emma moved out the very next day. Even now, she says she feels uneasy whenever she hears scratching noises at night or catches the faint scent of tobacco, haunted by the knowledge that her neighbor had been far too close, watching her every move from just behind the wall. And that's why it's always a good idea to check every closet, every hidden space, and especially any strange holes in the walls, just in case you're not alone. A woman named Claire had recently moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood, hoping for a fresh start. She'd left the bustle of city life behind, eager for the peace and security that came with her new home. Her house was charming, and her neighbors seemed polite but distant. She was fine with that after all. She was looking for a quiet life. The only peculiar thing was her next-door neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Dalton. He rarely left his house, and when he did, he shuffled around in an odd, slow manner, muttering to himself. Claire tried not to judge him. He was probably just a lonely, eccentric man. But what was strange was that every night, around midnight, he would be up, dragging what sounded like something heavy across the floor. The noise was loud enough to wake her up almost every night. She'd hear the distinct sound of something heavy scraping along the ground, moving from one side of his house to the other. She assumed it was probably a piece of furniture or an old heater he was trying to move around by himself. After a few nights of this, Claire started feeling uneasy. She couldn't explain why, but something about Mr. Dalton's nightly routine felt off. She tried asking him casually about it one afternoon, hoping to find an innocent explanation. But when she greeted him with a smile, he only stared at her for a long time, his eyes blank. Finally, he muttered something under his breath, turned around, and shuffled back into his house without another word. One night, as the noises began again, she decided to try something bold. She got a chair, stood by her window, and watched Mr. Dalton's house. She saw his living room lights flicker on and off as he dragged that mysterious object. Then out of nowhere, she saw him step out into his backyard, holding what looked like a shovel. He started digging. Claire felt a shiver go down her spine, but brushed it off, thinking maybe he was gardening at night, strange as it sounded. A few days later, Claire noticed something chilling on her way home from work. She passed a missing person poster on a telephone pole near her house. The woman in the photo looked familiar, and then it clicked she was a previous tenant of Mr. Dalton's house, whom she'd met briefly when she came to view her own home. This woman had vanished without a trace, just a few weeks after Claire moved in. The heavy dragging noises continued every night, and now she was terrified. She called the police, told them everything she'd noticed about her neighbor's strange behavior, the digging, and her fears. They agreed to check it out, mostly as a welfare check on Mr. Dalton. The officers knocked on Mr. Dalton's door, but there was no answer. They noticed the faint smell of something foul coming from inside, and they decided to force entry. As they went in, the stench grew stronger, leading them to the basement. When they finally entered, they found Mr. Dalton sitting there, cross-legged in a dark corner, mumbling and looking at an old moldy mattress. But what they found next was horrifying. Buried in shallow pits around the basement were multiple bodies, each in different stages of decay. The dragging sounds Claire heard every night. It was Mr. Dalton moving these bodies from one side of the basement to another. The missing woman, Claire remembered, was among them. It turned out that Mr. Dalton had been keeping his own grisly collection for years. Forensic analysis showed that the bodies had been taken over a span of decades. No one knew why he did it, whether it was a twisted form of companionship or something more sinister. Claire moved out soon after that. Even today, she says she can still hear the sound of that heavy, sickening drag in her nightmares.